Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this second session on presence, person, beauty. I have a very unpleasant surprise to us all. Unfortunately, Fabio Barry has been unable to join us, and so I shall step in and volunteer to present you a paper which I think will be apposite to the series, and you'll just have to endure it. So that's the idea. I don't know if Eric would like to say something.
Well,
Maybe a joke would be appropriate, but
yeah, no,
we do our best.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So as they say, you need no introduction, Jose. That's the main point.
That's
And
true, but
but
a
but
nice
no, I think
introduction is always good and pleasant, huh?
no,
But
it is. But anyway, just to say that actually, what you have been is a kind of a rather heroic figure who's brought us all together, has been the catalyst, and has never taken the the stage, so to speak. So I think it's absolutely wonderful that you are going to do this paper impromptu like this. Sorry to put you to the test, but I know that you'll rise brilliantly to the occasion. So and just to say, we really look forward to Fabio overcoming his technical malaise and being able to be with us full force in a coordinated fashion as soon as possible, because that's going to be a delight too. But in the meantime, I'm very excited to hear your paper, Jose. So on behalf of ourselves and London Met, let's go. And it's an amazing audience, so it's very, it seems to very, august and timely. So thank you, Jose.
You're very welcome. First of all, I'd like to thank Father Peter and Eric for the opportunity to contribute to this series, even though the circumstances aren't exactly the most favorable. And it's a series that we've been organizing together. So the suggested title for this talk is Image and Likeness. And I would like to begin with a brief quote from the Psalms, in this case from Psalm 27 or 26, depending on the version, from verse 8, which reads, "To you said my heart, seek my face. Your face, O God, I will seek." The search for God that has long guided our human journey is today no longer at the heart of our modern world. The historic change that we today generally and often hastily describe as modernity is far from being or becoming a matter of the past. It has affected our everyday language profoundly, from the way we understand and see our world, to the way we speak and communicate, and finally, our approach to the tangible nature of reality. But it has also affected us on a different level, one that more deeply than any change we can describe in purely historical terms, has been unfolding almost silently. The nature of that change can perhaps begin to be articulated more primarily through some of its most crucial manifestations, to be found, almost paradoxically perhaps, in the modern understanding of the difference that separates the human spirit from the more visible layers of discourse, our words from the being of things themselves, our sight from what things are, and more broadly, all across the question of the truth of representation. This fundamental difference, which is truly an abyss, or we could say the impregnable wall that separates us from that which stands beyond our sight, has long been discussed throughout the formation of modern thinking, in the understanding that it constitutes a necessary condition of possibility, and in that sense, a truly primary one, for our interpretation of the visible world. And to use the medieval adage, per visibilia ad invisibilia, through the visible towards the invisible. And we might perhaps also add, from light into the source of light. Consequently, the truth of what we know has also been a recurring subject of inquiry. And still, the primary emphasis should be here, not so much on the mystery of knowledge and the ways in which knowledge may come into being, valid as the question may be, as the deeper mystery of truth that endures in the ways in which we, limited as we are, represent what we see and understand of the being of things in our world. And I would like to begin with an image of Peter Bruegel, the Elder, the Tower of Babel. This dates from 1563. Traditionally, the difference that separates us from what things are found its identity in the distance that ultimately separated us from heaven, and finally, from that which stands before and beyond the created world. In the Bible, in Genesis, the text reads, and I quote, "Come, let us build to ourselves a city and tower, of which the top will be unto the heaven." The distance that separated us from that which stands beyond us was also the distance that separated us from the potential nature and full depth of the created world, from our very limited and all too human image and likeness of the world. In the same chapter and verse, the text reads, and I quote, "And let us make to ourselves a name before being scattered upon the face of all the earth." In view of this much broader but also narrowly human landscape, not the divine face but the earthly face, the question of what separates the images and likenesses we fashion from what they depict can hardly be said to be new. Also in Genesis, albeit in a different passage, the phrase image and likeness reports us to the paradoxical difference that separating humanity absolutely from their maker is nonetheless transcended in the biblical narrative by the fashioning of humanity in the divine image. But what of this image? I am including here an image of the Garden of Delights by Hieronymus Bosch. If I may quote from Genesis, "And God said, let us make humanity in our image, according to our likeness." And indeed, in Bosch's painting, this remarkable similarity is depicted also in the difference to the images of animals and birds. It should perhaps be noted that in the Hebrew Bible, the word image was arguably no more than a pictorial likeness, as a painting or sculpture, and much from exegetical to devotional texts is offered to us as an exhaustive and varied corpus of interpretation of that same passage. More widely in the scriptures, the word likeness, far from a perfect synonym, often seems to take on to the more general sense of appearance. And also in Genesis, there is ample reference to the making of light, its separation from darkness, the creation of the sun and the moon, and of the heavens, separating the waters above from those below. Here we see an image of the cupola of Genesis in San Marco in Venice. Similarly, this telling apart should be seen as a metaphor to the mystery of creation. It is almost as if the biblical narrative were a shadow of what it depicts, an image and likeness of the created world. And if we may venture the thought, perhaps the beauty of the text we find in Genesis is in many ways an image of the beauty of the created world, and the narrative itself a likeness to the work of creation. In looking at that same verse of Genesis, let us make humanity in our image according to our likeness, along with the Hebrew text, the Greek translation offered to us by the Septuagint may perhaps also help us open a door to the variety of images populating that ancient world. And although I'm not going to interpret the Hebrew or the Greek verse, I would like to underline only a few of the words which may perhaps be worth clarifying. Firstly, the word for making, or in this case, let us make, describes that which is produced, such as a work of art or literature, poiesis. and which we also know from the English words poem and poetry and so forth. Secondly, the word for humanity, Adam, or in Greek, anthropos, which is genderless, unlike the word for man, anir, which is not used in this instance. Thirdly, the word for likeness, which in this case would be homoiosis, which is in retrospect and throughout the history of Christianity something quite significant, and that would come to tell us that humanity is not made of the same divine substance, but of a similar substance or essence, similar but not the same. And finally, in ancient Greek, the word ikon, or icon, describes an image, but this is an altogether different sense to another word, also used at the time of the Greek translation, the eidolon, the idol. While in the Greco-Roman world, the idol was worshipped and cared for as an embodiment of the divinity, the icon, and the Christian icon in particular, was venerated neither for itself, nor as a mere window through which the divine could just be seen while remaining beyond reach. In fact, in early Christianity, and the liturgy of the Eastern Church is especially generous in this regard. I'm thinking, for instance, also of the writings of Saint Stephen the Younger. Those writings rigorously interpreted a sacred image or icon instead as a gate or doorway, whereby the divine crosses into the created world. Here we have an image of a project by Balls and Wilson from just a few years ago for the Icon Museum in Korç in Albania. Throughout centuries of art history, such images or icons have become altogether familiar. This particular museum was opened during the pandemic virtually, so you could, these are images of that virtual tour one could do. I myself, I must confess, I've never been there except during that time, which in itself already is quite paradoxical that icons are seen in this particular way. Everywhere today, our museums and galleries are bedecked with countless icons, sacred and religious images, and artifacts of all kinds. It probably goes without saying that we generally tend to take them for granted. They are shown to us as mere exhibits, the artistic spoils of a religious past. In the museum or gallery, in a sense, they have joined the other spolia of art history. It is perhaps only too easy to forget the sacred dimension of prayer and liturgy they once belonged to, a time when words and images summoned our limited understanding of that which stands beyond the confines of our more or less tangible world. Indeed, the difference that separates such images from what they depict is not only ontological, but unlike much of modern art, of a theological kind, and that could perhaps be best exemplified with the iconostasis, the icon stand or screen where the icons would be placed, connecting the sanctuary to the nave, and which we here see in the museum outside its original liturgical context. In a museum, a modern museum or gallery, the search that once animated and brought the traditional liturgical understanding of the icon to the fore is reduced to a historical context to be understood in the same way as one now looks into the remains of the past as a whole. But here, more importantly, the example of the museum or gallery may draw our attention to the fact that it is not the images as such that have lost their sacredness, but our museological interpretation, the way in which we view and display them, that has become so, merely by removing the sacred from sight. In other words, from a once sacramental world of prayer and liturgy, sacred icons have become a modern historical setting, which reflects a historical and finally theoretical approach, sometimes with admiration, an observation from afar, a door, as it were, now perceived only as a window. Of course, this is not to say that the whole enterprise of museification of exhibits that took flight from the late 18th century onward fails today in its factual assertion of art and history. But how to understand then the nature of what is being shown, if what is depicted is of its own nature sacred, separate from mundane secular affairs? If the church or cathedral was, and in many ways still is and holds, some measure of sacred ground, in contrast, the museum and gallery of today has mostly sustained only that outward character. And that same outward character of the sacred is all too apparent in the various manifestations that throughout modern history have reclaimed the sacred for modern art, namely the socially redeeming role of the museum or gallery and the venerable silence within its walls. Obviously, it is not the case that the inevitable partiality of our modern historical interpretation of sacred images should result in demolishing past efforts to preserve and document that very past. But it seems that it is this very impartiality, partial impartiality, one might say, that hides their true nature from sight. Here we see an image of a Salvator Mundi, in this case dating from the early 16th century. I say a Salvator Mundi because, as you know, there are many variations of that same theme. This is the one kept in the Doma Museum in Naples. The partiality of the museum or gallery, today in fact all too frequently destitute even from its once venerable silence, may seem now an irrevocable condition of our own time. More widely, while it may seem that the challenge raised by traditional understanding calls for a gradual, steadfast approach to the very theological nature of the icon, it is also the case that the presumed impartiality of modern historiography precludes its rehabilitation. And so, even challenging the partial view of history must conform to a certain form of impartiality. Especially in that impartial domain, the dome of contemporary interpretation often fails not only by omission, but also in its contextual approach. While the approach of contemporary history and theory of art is today taken almost as a given, albeit a problematic one, within the arts and humanities, it is also the case that neither one nor the other, neither history nor theory, can ever suffice in their approach to their own subjects of study. Ironically, and just as paradoxically as with many traditional terms in everyday usage, the word theory, which in today's common academic parlance seems to hold a historical and impartial grasp of the visual arts and humanities, still holds at its core the theos, the divinity that also informs the ancient understanding of the theoros, the seer, the viewer or spectator, the one who, in seeing, theorin, awaits, hopes, expects the unfolding of the action or drama on the theatrical setting, theatron. It is this seeing, which was akin to and traditionally a partaker of divine vision, theoria, that has now become relinquished by modernity in favor of the more common theory. Just as the icon, theory, in its traditional sense of contemplation, still carries the sacred at its core. Here we see an idol of Apollo, which dates from the 8th century BC, and is possibly the earliest idol that has come to us from that period, here cited by what seem to be Artemis and Leto. It is kept in the Archaeological Museum in Heraklion in Crete. In the ancient Greek and Roman worlds, and more widely throughout antiquity, theoria looked especially after the embodiment of the divinity, eidolon. First, in the world of mortals, and later in the theatre, the unfolding of the human narrative took place before the eyes of those who, akin to the gods, partook of the play. Indeed, it is almost paradoxical that in our time, theory should have become a modern epithet of abstraction. More often, its common usage, owing much to the sciences, describes only a theoretical construct. And yet, there is little doubt that neither the traditional understanding of theoria, which concerned the embodiment or worship of divinity, often manifest in the idol, nor theory, in its misguided application of modern art, are truly appropriate to the sacred icon. While embodiment has no doubt played a large role throughout antiquity, with a lasting legacy, as a concept it has also remained foreign to the central Christian message. Here we have an icon of Christ known as Sinai Pantokrator from St. Catherine's Monastery at Sinai, which dates from the mid-6th century and is certainly one of the oldest in existence. In Christianity, it was the Logos, the Word taking flesh, that answered the ancient hopes for the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. And in many ways, and indeed all those that are crucial, the Christian answer to the hopes of the people of Israel configured an altogether different narrative to that of the ancient Greek and Roman worlds of religious cult and worship. While using much of the same language of that ancient world, from the early Christian understanding of the central mystery of the incarnation of the Word, Logos, it was not the propitiation of the gods and their divine vision, theoria, through the cult rendered to the idols, idololatria, idolatry, that guided the life of worship, but the Word brought into practice, theologia, theology. This opens to us an altogether new and for us in many ways also very old horizon of understanding of the Christian icon. That theological understanding persisted throughout the history of Christian worship, even through the times of iconoclasm. If, on the one hand, such times could perhaps be said to share in the accusation of idolatry, on the other, it is perhaps also the very nature of the accusation that historically contributed the most to clarify what separates the icon from the idol. Perhaps history may have contributed, moreover, to open and settle the theological interpretation that, intuitively grasped already by early Christian art, was not exclusively confined to the spoken and written word, but addressed the nature of the visible world as a whole. Here we have a view of the interior of the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, which originally dates from the 13th century and whose stained glass windows were just restored again a few years ago. They had been restored before. Throughout the Middle Ages and more broadly, throughout that traditional setting, the theological inquiry into the nature of the visible world could perhaps be said to be twofold. And the word nature here is perhaps key. Unlike our modern understanding of nature, which sees the given world outside the scope of divinity, the traditional understanding of nature was explicitly founded on both the source and the structure of the created world, and carried with it a search that in numerous authors was altogether directed towards the structure of that which was visible, and finally its source, which was also the source of light and vision. The scriptural background to the medieval journey into the nature of the visible world began evidently in Genesis, and I quote again from Genesis, "And said God, let there be light, and there was light." And this is followed by a number of instances in which the intrinsic goodness and beauty of creation is recognized by the divine vision. In the next verse, with regard to light, and then all along that chapter, and God saw that it was good. And then in recognition of the goodness and beauty of the whole of the created world, from the Hebrew, and God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was good. Or if we take it from the Septuagint, and God saw all that he made, and behold, it was exceedingly good or beautiful. The ambivalence of the word good or beautiful in Greek, kalos, has often been repeated throughout the discussion of the good in ethics and philosophy, especially in the tradition of Western thought that has its sources in Greek thought, and which is, of course, attested by the language itself. The translation of the Bible, and of Genesis in particular, into Greek precedes Christianity, and so does the word for good. But that very same thought and identity of the good with the beautiful, and vice versa, would also be reflected, and very especially from very early on in Christianity. In the well-known passage, "Why do you call me good?" only one is good. In the original Greek text of the Gospel reads, or could be more aptly translated, good in the sense of sacred. This brings us to the matter of visibility, and I will like to conclude by saying the following. The role of light and vision would remain central throughout much of the medieval world and the time that followed. But that being the case of that venerable inquiry into the visible, itself a mystery whose full depths shall forever remain beyond the narrow limitations of our human comprehension, what to say then of the divine source of vision in that same traditional setting? And to which extent can we say that not only are we made, but that we live in the divine image and likeness? In other words, to which extent can we truthfully say that in our wantings and doings, in our everyday affairs, we remain true to that very same condition, to a living reflection of the divine image and likeness, which calls for a continuous communication with the source of light and vision of the image and likeness we are, in what is or would be, to put it in traditional terms, essentially a life of prayer. That seems to me, at least, to reflect one of the crucial challenges we are called to face in this also very practical sense. A life that brings theoria, in its true sense of contemplation, also into work. And let me close with a quotation from St. Paul that I'm sure many of you will know, but I think also speaks of that very clear challenge. And I quote, "Rejoice always, pray unceasingly, give thanks in all things, for that is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." This is from 1 Thessalonians 5. It seems to me that our path in this regard must be one of truth. Truth is the whole truth and not just part of it. And as a result, none of us is the sole owner and proprietor of the truth, especially when it comes to the visual arts. And in that regard, we are perhaps only in the way of truth. But even being in the way, we are perhaps now, and then also in the way of in which truth comes about through us, or perhaps for the most part, despite us. There is, of course, in this understanding, an underlying assumption that truth reveals herself not just despite ourselves, but even through our own faults and limitations. And why not say it even through our own sins, and then perhaps even more blatantly so? Not a greater truth, but a blatant truth, shown, as it were, through a mirror, a truth in reverse. And then how far have we drifted away from the mystery of truth in its full measure? And finally, we may ask ourselves, what is truth? And if truth cannot be asserted, what then of a lie? What consequence would it bear? What would a lie be without truth? Perhaps a tentative answer may be, lies hide, truth shows, lies pretend to be, truth is. Where lies bring darkness, truth brings light. We do not come to light, the light comes to us. Where lies hide, truth shows, lies seem to be, truth is. But we must go further still and say, truth stands before and beyond being. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. I think a moment's pause is probably necessary for collection of some thoughts, but who would like to open a response? Perhaps Peter.
I'd like to ask you, this truth you speak about as human through sense experience, how as an Aristotelian Thomist myself, we, as it were, are active engagers, active searchers for this truth by an intentional relationship with reality, and that the traditional structure of knowing, which is St. Thomas, Aristotle, St. Thomas, Bernard Lonergan, would end with the judgment that this is the case, and therefore this is true, and because it's true, it has a moral force about it. That, I think, this engagement with reality also involves what Aristotle calls agent intellect, the fact that our mind, heart, brain, soul is switched on. It's not switched on by thinking, it's switched on at the moment of conception, moment of beginning of life. So there are two things I think here. I'd also like to put in this general picture the fact that if one's a Christian, one recognizes the Word became flesh, the universal took on particular form, and therefore the universal finds itself in a particular person of Jesus Christ. But with that, more importantly, the culture, I would say the symbols of faith, as with the biography of Jesus, but also the sort of a sacramental system that comes from his life and the basic tenets of his life that become the teachings of the church. But it's this symbols of faith that I think is fundamental, that it is the source of tradition and then opens up into culture. I mean, sorry to be a bit waffly, but I'm quite interested in what you have to say, but I think you come from a more Platonist perspective than perhaps I do myself.
I'm not sure. I agree. Sorry. I agree with everything you said. So you put me in a very difficult position. You alluded to, of course, the understanding of the purpose or the end of the meaning of life in Thomas Aquinas, which is, of course, the contemplation of truth. This varies in terms along the history of the church. The beatific vision sometimes would be the word in which that would be described in the beatific vision is, of course, the theoria, the contemplation of God. We can go back to Bonaventure, who speaks precisely of that same aim in different terms. So we're on the same page. The crucial point, I think, is that in speaking of that which stands before us and before being as a whole, we are inevitably concerned also with the way in which theology can come about and our own understanding of truth can be articulated. In other words, that which we know, and we know in faith through sacred tradition, living tradition, through the sacraments, through the scriptures, we know in metaphorical terms in most cases. And indeed, that is the way in which traditionally theology has spoken of that which cannot be spoken of. Theology speaks in terms of being, of that which is not being, of that which precedes being, and even as we say the word precedes, stands before, stands beyond, whether we talk about transcendence or precedence, absolute precedence, we are still using terms which pertain to ontology, that pertain to being. And indeed, that is all we can do, or we can deny it. It is the typical. I'm only telling you what you already know. It is the typical dualism of cataphatic or apophatic theology. Either we speak in terms of being or we deny it, but we are referring to that which cannot be said, except in those terms. Except in those terms. And so truth is, of course, entirely beyond us, if we may put it again, in those more or less poetic terms. It does not belong to us. Yes, of course, you are right. From a Christian point of view, that is indeed the only possible understanding. We do not own truth. It is not a truth of information, a truth of data. Truth is, in the scriptures, in the tradition of the church and Christianity, of course, the person of Christ, the truth incarnate. So I'm not sure I've answered your question. I fear I may be leaving you quite dissatisfied.
No, not at all. But I was thinking about engagement with those that maybe aren't Christians, so whereby you and I can understand. But I was keen about, how can I say, not just really be a missionary, but the fact that the structures of human knowing, when actually contain within themselves an element of necessary transcendence, both on the journey there, but also actually before the journey starts because of the agent intellect. Okay, so therefore that when this is blocked out, thinking is, I think, sort of frayed or sort of partial, and that's why and that's why I think that's why I was thinking of a sort of natural religion of sort of, as it were, previous times actually helps to understand the created world and also the built environment.
Well, you're touching on a question which has often puzzled me, and I'm not sure I have an answer for it. Of course, in the Gospels, you see many times a sort of misunderstanding that often occurs between the character of Jesus and that of the apostles. It's sometimes very curious that the apostles don't understand the parables that they are being told, and sometimes even explain after when those parables are explained, they still don't fully grasp them. We are still interpreting. We are still getting a great deal out of the scriptures. So I'm not sure I have an answer for you, but I mean, I understand the difficulty, especially if you are fully engaged in pastoral work. Communication and in simple and not necessarily simplistic terms is, of course, a challenge. I think architecture sins very often by technicality. But without trying to sound technical at all, I fear that I cannot do any better than this.
Okay, thank you.
That's the only answer I've got. But I don't think that. I think that even if one puts it in very simple terms, that does not necessarily secure us or guarantee us any plateau of understanding.
Okay.
However simple the words may be, and sometimes they can be extremely simple. We can talk about, for instance, that which stands before being. Well, each of those words is simple, but that which is being said is not. And in fact, it is entirely beyond us.
Thank you. Have others got some questions that they could raise? Christian, is that a...
Yeah, I'll have a go.
That'd be great.
It's very obviously a very detailed debate that you're talking about, and I was just very interested in the scope. Obviously, when one's bringing in theology, one goes back thousands of years, really. But I'm particularly interested in the relationship between pre-Thomist theology and whether the nature of truth in, say, the 12th century Renaissance of theology, in the debate, but potentially in very simplistic terms, between faith and wisdom, and the relationship. What's the relationship of truth in that debate? Because obviously, I mean, I didn't go, when I was looking into some of the medieval architecture, I didn't go beyond around the mid 13th century, so Thomism wasn't really an issue for me at that point. But certainly the debates around truth and wisdom, with people like Abelard working on, the lines of heresy at that point, trying to understand how truth could be found within those differences, and how art and architecture sits in that world. So I suppose the question is pre-Thomism, is the relationship that you're arguing between being and art seen in a different way in relation to the truth as after Thomas?
Yeah. Thank you. That's actually very helpful. I think that there is, yes, a fundamental difference, and I'm not entirely sure that it depends solely on Thomas. So I don't have a full answer for you, but I think the key, maybe, if I can try and help, may lie in the word wisdom, and also its relation to truth, as you put it. As you know, the highest form of thought available to us, in the tradition that we belong to, the tradition of Western thought, is practical wisdom. That is the understanding that has been kept and passed on to us, even in a personal level. I remember, if I may put it on a personal level, having the same talk with Dalibor Vesely. Gadamer believed that indeed practical wisdom, the kind of which is used on an everyday basis, say in an architectural office, is the highest form of thought, because it engages with the world directly, and it is based on an understanding of that world which is founded on experience. This is crucially different from the kind of knowledge that, say, for instance, a youth would have. And there you go back to, say, Aristotle and pre-Thomistic understanding. As you know, Aristotle's works were only recovered in the 12th century, 12th, 13th century. And that played an immense role in the writings of that period that followed, and that included then Aristotle, Aquinas being the crucial source, no doubt. But we also have to take into account the fact that within the same Western tradition of thought, and especially in that crucial part of the tradition which is sacred, and that was guided by Christianity, the deepest understanding of thought, and I'm thinking, for instance, of the monastic tradition, that the highest form of thought would have been contemplation. And contemplation, theoria, contemplation is the usual translation for the Greek word, is the highest, and not just because it engages with the world, but because it engages with that which stands beyond the practical domain of reality. So there is indeed a great deal to be said about this difficult relationship of wisdom to truth, because it's really a tension, I think, in my own understanding. And I speak here yes, I am fully aware of the modesty of the thought I'm about to venture. I believe that the highest degree of thought depends on that which is thought about. In other words, to think of the lowest of things in this world describes the type of thought we are having, just as thinking of the highest things. So the highest form of thought, in my view, is the thought of God. There is no highest thought available to us. It is not possible. And so to think of God is, in truth, to think of prayer. And so I would say that the highest form of thought available to us does not depend on one's own ability, but depends solely on one's faith, and rests entirely in the hands of God. It is entirely up to God to carry out the task of thinking. And so I agree with what someone once said, that we don't come to thought, thoughts come to us. This is entirely true. But then that also means that thought does not depend on each of us. It depends on thought itself. And so I would say that, unlike Heidegger, being is not the most fundamental question that should be asked, but that which stands before being. And the word that is used, of course, in our own tradition, the Latin word for that is pre-esse, presentia, presence. Presence is that which stands before being, pre-esse. And we say it, of course, in metaphorical terms. But those metaphorical terms are the ones that refer to that which is real and true and substantial. And in doing so, our thought stretches to the very limit of what we can articulate. Beyond that, we cannot say.
Thank you.
Others? I can't see any other questioners, but it seems to me that you have articulated something of the title of this series, and this might have been an opening contribution around that those issues of presence, person, and beauty. It would be very interesting to, and you know, I ending with Sainte-Chapelle and common ground actually with Fabio Barry in his book Painting in Stone, that image. It would be very interesting to be able to draw this to a common ground of materiality and spatial setting through the articulation of material, not least light and water, as a vehicle to allow these you know, very articulate ideas to a world of the present, of the situational, and perhaps that's for another time. But it would be interesting to hear your ideas on that question of materiality a little further, if you could.
Yeah, I think that there are two aspects to what to your intervention. One is the title of the series. The title of the series has, I think, three crucial points, which I find are the most fundamental for theology today. The first, of course, is the matter of presence, because it concerns precisely the most fundamental question that I believe can be asked and should be asked by theology, no less. The second is person, and person, the matter of personhood, which has been explored recently, even and throughout the last few decades in theology, has a long history. It underlies our understanding of the Trinity, insofar as we can go in saying anything about the Trinity, and we can say a great deal, but always too little. And it concerns also our own face, our own personhood. I'm sure many of us already know this. The word person in Greek, of course, prosopon, meant originally face or mask. There's a similar word, almost synonym in Latin, persona. But there is another word in Greek, of course this won't be news to you, which is hypostasis. And hypostasis means precisely the same thing in common parlance in Greek, but if we look at the formation of the word, hypostasis means that which is underneath. So in a sense, a substance. This gets to be very confusing, but let's just say that we are talking of the difference that separates the mask that we put on a daily basis to do our work, a role we play, and so on and so forth. The difference that separates that from the person we are, from the face we truly have, rather than the mask. And in so doing, in looking at the question of personhood, we are therefore addressing not only the matter of truth, but also the matter of visibility, the truth of representation, the truth of vision. This brings us to the question of beauty. And the question of beauty, of course, in the traditional understanding of the Septuagint that guided early Christianity, is identical to good. That which is beautiful is good. The Hebrew word tov is much more, it's plainer, perhaps. It simply means good. But in the Greek, of course, we have that. There is a matter of beauty, and God saw that it was good. So there is something that the Greek translation found in the scripture, which directly connects us to the visibility of the created world in its beauty. The second point, of course, that of your kind intervention, Eric, is the matter of materiality. And the question of materiality and light, that would bring us several thousand years forward into the whole exploration of the metaphysics and geometry of light throughout the Middle Ages, and then especially throughout the 17th century. And I'm afraid I won't be able to summarize it here. But the understanding of material, that which is material and concrete, was articulated in different terms. In the Middle Ages and up until, yes, and even up until the 18th century, the word that was used was corporeal. Everything would be articulated, of course, in terms of body, the body of light and so on, speaking of the volume of light. That which is the body of light, for instance. I'm thinking of Patrizi, Franciscus Patrizi would talk about that. The body of light is an incorporeal body. In other words, it has a spatiality of its own, but that spatiality is not material. We have to be careful with the word material in the Middle Ages, because the matter at hand is not necessarily something you can hold in your hand. It's simply the matter that is being discussed and so on. The material cause of something isn't necessarily something you can hold in your hand. Somehow the Middle Ages, down to earth as it was less concerned with the difference than we are. So I think those are the two important points. The rest, I would have to say, there's still much to be done. There's unfortunately too little that has been written so far about the metaphysics and geometry of light. Dalrymple contributed to it in part, and there's much more still to be done. That's all I can say.
Other questions can I ask? And please tell me if So I think Elizabeth Theokritoff raised a question there, or an observation.
No, I think it was. Well, I'm sure Elizabeth can speak for herself, but I believe it was. Let me read. Regarding light, confront meditation on Hagia Sophia, Constantinople, from Olivier Clément. Dialogues with Patriarch Athenagoras. I will send extract to José, and we will be looking forward to it. Elizabeth, thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, Dagmar is now raised a hand, so perhaps over to you, Dagmar.
No,
you're on
you're
mute.
muted.
There. Thank you. That was very interesting. I'm sorry, it's quite difficult, I find, to engage with some of this discussion, theological discussion, if you're an outsider to it. And so my question is much more peripheral, and it has to do with the iconostasis, which you showed. It strikes me that there's a lot of similarity, both formally and probably thematically as well, between that and the Roman theatre facade, the Skene France. And I just wondered, in the Greek Orthodox tradition, how is that understood? I mean, the gateway, the screen, which holds the images and has 3 doorways in it through which only certain people can pass. How is that whole action, the passage and the sort of the framing of the entrances understood?
That's a very good question, and I think we are talking really of two very distinct things. I don't think that what happened in the Greek theatre, and even less in the Roman theatre, could be equated in any way to the Christian liturgy. What is happening?
Also appeared in the openings.
Yes, I know, but I don't think. I think we're talking about two very, very distinct things, even though in appearance they may seem quite similar. I'm not sure that the passages in the Skene France could be in any way compared to the doorway of the iconostasis. The iconostasis is a doorway, but that is the crucial thing with the iconostasis, is that it also speaks of the nature of the icon. In other words, before the icon, you are presented with a doorway rather than just a window. You don't just see the icon, you see. So that's a fundamental difference. And I'm not the first one to see it. I'm here only repeating that which many others have said in the past. So I think bringing in the Greek theatre, especially the Greek theatre, is thought-provoking. But I'm not sure would take us very far in the understanding of the meaning of the iconostasis, which is liturgical.
Yes, yes. So with the iconostasis, the fact that only certain very few people can pass through it, the priests and so on, does that somehow symbolize the fact that that is the relationship that ordinary people have to the divine, that they always somehow see it through, only from a distance through a screen?
Well, I think you're probably thinking of the iconostasis as a barrier, whereas in the building tradition it belongs to, it's a doorway.
It's a door.
And so the actual passing through, yes, which happens in the various liturgies and throughout the history, it does not necessarily mean anything other. Quite on the contrary, it reinforces that very same reality. It
Yes.
speaks of the reality. Yes.
So I know that now we have a request from Elizabeth Theokritoff to
Yes.
respond. So could I
Excellent.
ask her to come in?
Thank you. Sorry, I haven't got a camera attached. Yeah, it's an interesting question, and unfortunately I came late, so I didn't see what was said earlier about the iconostasis. And I don't know what the historical origins of it are, and whether it had any connection with the theatre. I rather doubt it, because, you know, given that the early church wasn't terribly keen on the Greek theatre. Certainly the iconostasis as a boundary goes back long before there were icons on it. That I do know. It was a much lower barrier without icons. And yeah, I mean, barrier is not the right word. A boundary, a delineation. And it is related to the idea that the church is an image of the world, of all creation. So you have, yes, we have pictures of this is a highly ornate and developed iconostasis. I mean, you know, very, the one that's on the screen, very, very unlike the early ones, which would have been just the lowest tier below where the icons start. But it is the idea that the church represents earth and heaven, and therefore the nave and the sanctuary. And the sanctuary, in a sense, is where none of us belong in our own right, and therefore where Christ has gone, and so where the bishop and the clergy go liturgically representing him, and, you know, the deacon goes back and forth imaging the joining of the two. And that I think is an important point, that the iconostasis is or the screen is something that people pass through and go back and forth, and it's, you know, it's an image of where we're all going. And in a way, an iconostasis like the one on the screen, beautiful though it is something of a corruption of what the screen was originally meant to be, because it wasn't meant to make the sanctuary look totally inaccessible, but to make the point that we have to pass over from our daily life in order to reach it. So thank you.
Thank you. Dagmar.
Is that any help?
I think it's tremendously helpful, yes. But I think Dagmar was meaning to say something.
I was just having problems with the muting here. Yes, thank you very much. That clarifies things.
Sorry. So, Nicholas, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I was just sorry, I'll just put my camera on. I was just interested in the context of the dispute that erupted between Theodosius I and Ambrose when in Milan, which is recorded, of course, when the emperor basically traverses into the sanctuary amongst the clergy and the bishop, assuming that his role in the church in Italy, in Milan, was the same or comparable to what was identified as acceptable practice in the Byzantine tradition, Byzantine or the Eastern Empire. I'm kind of interested in how that manifests itself in this the concept of this threshold as a threshold of imperium as well as of the clergy.
That's a very good question, and I'm not sure I have an answer. It's really not my field of expertise. There's, I'm sure, as you know, plenty of cases in which the imperial figure and the figure of the priesthood, really, of the Byzantine world come together. In fact, it was the other way around. As you know, it first started the attributes of the divinity, and that were then worn by Roman emperors, were then inherited by Christianity. I'm thinking, for instance, a very obvious thing you will find in the icons of the period. Again, I'm probably only telling what you already know, Nick. One of the obvious attributes of the period is, of course, the golden halo, the golden sun, which pertained to Apollo as a sign of the divinity of Apollo, and was then worn by the Roman emperor. There's a number of images and imagery of Roman emperors represented with the sun, and that, of course, is then inherited by Christ and the apostles. At one point, the emperor is still represented with the halo. So all that is a very, very rich world of imagery, which I'm sure will have been reflected also at that time. But when it comes to the orthodoxy of the emperor taking up the presbyterium, I'm not sure I can answer that. Would it have been possible? I suppose yes, because in some cases in the early councils, the validity of a council depended on the emperor. And so for the council to be ecumenical, the emperor needed to be present. That varied greatly throughout the history of the church, as you know. But that will legitimize that liturgical action. But I don't know in that particular case what that significance would have been beyond political.
Okay. Thank you. I think that was marvelous, impromptu, and very articulate and eloquent contribution. So our thanks to Jose, not just for this, but for everything else that he's enabled. And as a postscript, we very much look forward, of course, to Fabio's contribution in due course. But thank you to everyone, and Jose, superb stepping in.
Well, I'm the first. I'm the one who should be thankful for the opportunity. The only one thing I should say is that if I said anything that's wrong, please do correct me, because I really do not wish to step over my own ability. But in truth, I think I said what I believe to be the case, and if